A single Sherman tank sat burning on the outskirts of Coutances, France, July 28, 1944. That is not the remarkable part. The remarkable part is what the German engineers found when they walked up to examine it 3 hours later, before American infantry pushed them back. They found the hull had been struck from an angle that their own calculations said was impossible. The shot had come from a direction where no tank should have been able to reach. The terrain made it geometrically impossible. Their defensive map, drawn with precision by trained Wehrmacht engineers, showed nothing but a flooded drainage ditch and a collapsed farm wall in that quadrant. And yet, the tank had been there. It had fired, and it had moved again before they could answer it. In the days that followed, I captured German field reports from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, began referencing an American problem they could not solve. Not the firepower problem, not the supply problem, the thinking problem. American armor and infantry were moving through terrain that German doctrine declared impassable, striking positions that German defensive logic declared untouchable, and disappearing before German reaction forces could fix them in place. General Major Wilhelm Meindl wrote in a situation report dated August 2nd, "The Americans are not fighting the ground. They are using the ground as a weapon against us." He had no answer for how to stop it. That answer, that problem, had a name. It wore 2 stars. And the soldiers who executed it were running on 3 days without sleep, fighting with ammunition they'd scavenged from dead comrades, guided by maps that were already wrong when they were printed. How did they do it? How did a small group of Americans, outnumbered, cut off, and operating on bad intelligence, crack a German defensive line that Wehrmacht engineers had spent 6 weeks building? That is exactly what this video is going to show you. Part 1. The weight of the mission. By the summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered its most dangerous phase, not because the Allies were losing, but because they were not winning fast enough. The Normandy breakout, Operation Cobra, had torn a hole in the German line west of St. Lo on July 25th. But punching a hole and exploiting a hole are 2 completely different military problems. German commanders, battered, improvising, furious, were doing exactly what desperate defenders do best. Anchoring on terrain features, using every road junction, every stone wall, every drainage canal as a delaying position. Every hour the Americans spent fighting through a hedgerow was an hour the Germans used to construct the next defensive line further south. The prize was Avranches, a small coastal city at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Avranches sat at the mouth of a geographical bottleneck, the only viable route for an armored force to swing south and then east into the open terrain of Brittany and the Loire Valley. Take Avranches, and Patton's Third Army could pour through like water through a broken dam. Lose the race to Avranches, and the breakout stalled. The war extended, the body count climbed. Third Army's 8th Corps had the assignment. And within 8th Corps, in the 4th Armored Division, already earning a reputation as Patton's sharpest instrument, was driving hard down the western corridor. Captain James Langdon Weber, 29, of Macon, Georgia, commanded C Company, 8th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division. He had been in Europe since the Normandy landings, had survived the murderous hedgerow fighting of July, and had developed, through a combination of instinct and hard education, a working understanding of what Patton's headquarters actually meant when they transmitted their acceleration orders. Weber was not a flashy officer. His men described him as quiet, a man who talked less than he thought, which in the summer of 1944 was exactly the kind of officer you wanted at the front. His executive officer, First Lieutenant Raymond Okafor, 24, from Cleveland, Ohio, kept a running diary. In an entry dated July 27th, he wrote, "Weber doesn't sleep. He studies. He takes the map and he turns it upside down. He looks at the ground the way the Germans look at it, and then he looks for what they missed. I've watched him do this 3 times now. 3 times he's found the thing they missed. I don't know if he knows he's doing it. C Company's mission on the morning of July 28th was tactically specific and strategically vital. Neutralize a German anti-tank gun emplacement and supporting infantry position at a crossroads identified in intelligence reports as Carrefour Brûlé, burned crossroads, approximately 4 kilometers southwest of Coutances. The crossroads controlled the only paved road through a stretch of marshy lowland. An 88mm anti-tank gun there could hold up the entire divisional advance for a day or more. A day was too long. Patton's standing order, delivered personally through the chain into every company commander's skull, was that units encountering resistance were to bypass it wherever possible, find the gaps, and keep moving. But you cannot bypass an 88 that covers every bypass. The intelligence picture delivered at 0400 on July 28th described a single 88mm gun with a crew of 8, protected by approximately 20 infantry from a Volksgrenadier unit that had been badly chewed up at St. Lo. The informant, a French farmer who had observed the position for 3 days, reported that the gun faced northeast, covering the main road approach, and that the position had no protection on its southwestern flank. And the engineers had built their defensive logic around the assumption that the marshy terrain to the southwest, the drained fields around the Hameau de Vaucelles, was impassable for tracked vehicles. Weber studied the map for 11 minutes. Then he asked the S2 officer a single question. When was this map surveyed? The answer was 1938. Weber said nothing. But Lieutenant Okafor, standing 3 feet away, saw the captain's jaw tighten. 12 kilometers away, in a commandeered farmhouse outside Coutances, Hauptmann Ernst Dietrich Kroll of the 2nd SS Panzer Division's reconnaissance section was writing a situation assessment. He had spent 4 days observing American armored behavior and had concluded, in language that would later be described by his own divisional commander as dangerously complacent, that American armor moved predictably along road networks, lacked the initiative to exploit soft terrain, and would approach Carrefour Brûlé along the northeast road, exactly as the 88 was positioned to destroy them. He wrote, "The Americans fight bravely but mechanically. They have been given excellent equipment by their factories and adequate tactics by their manuals. What they lack is the improvisational instinct of the German soldier. They will do what their training tells them to do. Our position at the crossroads will hold for 48 hours minimum, buying the time necessary for..." The report trails off there. Kroll was interrupted by a courier, and he finished it later. He would wish he hadn't. What nobody in either army knew yet, not Kroll, not Weber, not the French farmer, and certainly not the S2 officers working from 1938 survey maps, was that 6 weeks of summer rain had done something to the marshy lowlands of the Hameau de Vaucelles that no one had thought to check. They had dried out. Part 2. The Trap Springs. C Company moved out at 0537 Shermans and 2 half-tracks carrying the infantry attachment. 31 men in total. The morning was gray and close, the kind of Norman summer morning that smells like cut grass and diesel and something older beneath both. Weber's plan was straightforward. 2 tanks would demonstrate along the northeast road, making noise, drawing attention, and the remaining 5 Shermans would loop south through the Hameau de Vaucelles, through the supposedly impassable marsh, and strike the 88's blind flank. The plan lasted 40 minutes. Corporal Dennis Farragut, 21, Knoxville, Tennessee, was the driver of the lead tank in the southern column. He wrote in his after-action account, filed on August 4th, "We went into the Vaucelles ground easy enough. Ground was firmer than anyone thought. Weber was up in his hatch grinning. I thought, this is going to work. That's when the first round hit the second tank. It wasn't an 88, it was two 88s, and they weren't facing northeast. The intelligence had been wrong in almost every particular. The French farmer had counted one gun. There were two. He had identified 20 infantry. There were 60, each from a unit that was not a battered Volksgrenadier remnant, but a combat-effective company of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, rested, resupplied, and waiting. And the guns did not face northeast. They faced northeast and southwest. The German engineers had hedged. They had looked at the 1938 maps, looked at the actual ground, and added a second gun to cover the southwest approach, because the ground had dried out. And they had noticed. The ambush hit C Company at 0611. 2 seconds of silence after Farragut's tank registered the first round. Then the world came apart. The 2nd Sherman in the column, Sergeant Marcus Cole's tank, took an 88 round through the glacis plate at a range of less than 200 meters. The shell did not penetrate all the way through. It didn't need to, and the spalling killed Cole's driver instantly and wounded Cole in both hands. The loader, Private First Class Antonio Vega, 19, from San Antonio, pulled Cole out of the cupola one-handed while the tank burned. Vega was never formally decorated for this. He should have been. Weber's radio crackled immediately. The two-tank demonstration force on the northeast road had just triggered a third defensive position, a machine gun nest they had not known existed. They were pinned. The northeast road was closed, and then the radio delivered the second blow. Corps headquarters, monitoring the developing engagement, transmitted new orders at 0618. C Company was to break contact and withdraw to allow an airstrike to be called on the Carrefour Brûlé position. The airstrike would take approximately 4 hours to coordinate. 4 hours. Weber looked at his situation. 2 tanks were in hull-down positions taking fire from the front. Sergeant Cole's tank was burning. The half-tracks had pulled back into a tree line. 3 of his 5 southern approach Shermans were combat effective. He had 31 men, minus Cole's driver, minus 2 others from the half-tracks who had taken machine gun fragments. He had perhaps 40 minutes of effective ammunition before he would be fighting with whatever he'd been issued and nothing more. And in the northeast tree line, 300 meters away, 60 soldiers of Das Reich were beginning to move. He keyed the radio and told Corps he had received their transmission. He did not say he was withdrawing. At his command post, Hauptmann Kroll received the ambush report and felt for a moment the clean satisfaction of prediction confirmed. And the Americans had walked into the trap. His situation report had been correct. He transmitted to division that the crossroads position was holding. Then came the first anomaly. His forward observer reported that the burning American tank's surviving crew had not retreated. They had taken up positions in a drainage ditch and were returning fire with small arms. And the American tanks, those that remained, had not turned back toward the northeast road. They had stopped moving. Kroll frowned at the map. Stopped moving made no sense. They should be withdrawing or pressing. Stopped tanks were neither offensive nor defensive. They were thinking. And that, in Kroll's experience, was when the Americans were most dangerous. He reached for the field telephone to request reinforcements. He had said he wouldn't need reinforcements for 48 hours. A like on this video takes 2 seconds. For Marcus Cole and Antonio Vega and every man burning in every tank on every map that's already wrong. It is the least we can do. Part 3. The Patton Principle. George S. Patton had said it 100 times in 100 different rooms. He said it to division commanders, and he said it to company commanders, and he said it to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear it. He had been saying a version of it since the First World War, and by the summer of 1944 it had been drilled into the operational culture of his army with the insistence of a theological doctrine. Never make the same decision twice. The enemy knows your doctrine. He does not know your mind. The second principle, the one that mattered more in the ditch where Weber was now lying on his back staring at the gray sky, neat while a German machine gun stitched holes through the hedgerow above his head, was simpler still. Patton had written it in the Third Army's field orientation document, distributed to every officer down to company grade. An obstacle is not a wall. It is a question. The question is, what does the enemy believe about this obstacle? Answer that question correctly and the obstacle becomes a door. Weber had read it. And lying there while the radio demanded withdrawal and the clock ate his ammunition count, he answered the question. The Germans believed the marsh was impassable, or they had until recently. They had added the second gun because they'd realized the ground might be usable. But their second gun faced the same direction as the first, covering the open approach. They had solved the terrain problem, and they had not solved the thinking problem. Both guns looked at the approach. Neither gun looked at the farm. There was a farm. It was on no one's operational map because it had been abandoned in 1941 and had since disappeared behind overgrowth, invisible from any approach except from the ground at a specific angle, if you were lying on your back in a ditch staring southwest because a machine gun had put you there. The farm sat 70 meters behind the German gun position. It also sat within 3 meters of a civilian problem. The farmhouse was abandoned, but its stone outbuilding was not. 3 Norman civilians and an elderly woman and 2 children Weber's lead scout had spotted during the initial approach had taken shelter in the outbuilding, directly in the planned line of fire if he used his tank guns to suppress the German position from the farm approach. This is the moment that doesn't appear in any tactical manual. This is the moment that appears in letters home and in nightmares years later. Weber had 2 choices. Call the airstrike, 4 hours away, which would almost certainly destroy the outbuilding and everyone in it because the coordinates for the airstrike had been plotted before anyone knew the civilians were there. Or use his tanks, which meant threading 3 Shermans through the farm approach with enough precision to take out the gun crews without touching the outbuilding. He chose the tanks. He sent his 2 remaining able-bodied infantrymen from the half-track. Privates Gerald Mwangi, 22, Nairobi-born, and Louis Tran, 23, New Orleans, to the outbuilding with a single order. Get them out. Move them into the lowest ground behind the eastern wall as far from the gun line as possible. Do it in the next 10 minutes. Then he turned his 3 Shermans southwest, slid them along the drainage ditch, and found the farm approach. Mwangi and Tran made it to the outbuilding in 6 minutes. The elderly woman refused to move for 30 seconds. Louis Tran later said she looked at his face and seemed to make a decision. She took both children by the hand and followed. It cost them 4 minutes. They made it behind the eastern wall with 90 seconds to spare. If the story of James Weber and these 30 men has stayed with you, the channel that brings you accounts like this one needs your support to keep going. Subscribe. These stories deserve to be remembered. Part 4. The breaking point. Weber's 3 tanks entered the farm approach in column, rolling at 6 kilometers per hour, engines throttled low, relying on the noise of the ongoing firefight to mask their movement. The farm approach was a compressed corridor of overgrown lane, roughly 4 meters wide, bordered on both sides by hedgerows so dense it blocked all visibility beyond 5 meters. Weber's driver, Private First Class James Jimmy Aldrich, 20, from Fayetteville, Arkansas, was threading a 30-ton machine through a lane built for horse-drawn carts, by feel, in a direction no German gun was pointing. 40 meters from the farm gate, the lead track hit soft ground. Not the soft ground of the marsh, a different soft ground. A shell crater partially filled with water, invisible under the overgrowth, positioned exactly where the weight of the tank's left track was committed to fall. The lead Sherman lurched, the right track caught. The tank pivoted 15 degrees left and jammed, hull sideways in the lane, blocking the 2 tanks behind it. Stop. Think about what that means. The entire maneuver, the flanking movement, the 10 minutes bought by Mwangi and Tron, the precision approach that was supposed to hit the gun position before the German crew even knew an American tank was behind them. All of it now sat behind a stuck Sherman in a 4-meter lane, with 60 soldiers of Das Reich less than 40 meters away. Weber was out of his hatch before the tank finished pivoting. On the ground, moving forward. He looked at the track, looked at the ground, and in 4 seconds made a calculation that no field manual had prepared him to make. The tank could not reverse. The crater held it. But the hedgerow on the right side, 3 meters of Norman earth and root in history, might not be as solid as it looked. Sherman tanks weighed 30 tons. Hedgerows were hedgerows. He got back in the cupola, told Aldrich to give the right track full power, and told the crew to brace. The tank did not break through the hedgerow. The hedgerow broke, not cleanly, not easily, with a sound that Farragut in the 3rd tank described as a building falling sideways, a sustained tearing roar that lasted 4 seconds and probably saved the mission by giving the German gun crew exactly 1 second of confusion about what they were hearing. The Sherman burst through the hedgerow gap into the farmyard. I found a line of sight to the 1st 88's left flank, and Weber gave the order to fire. First round, 11 meters. Direct hit on the gun shield. The 88 was silenced before its crew had turned to face the new threat. Here is where the enemy's overconfidence became the mechanism of their destruction. Kroll's defensive plan had positioned both guns facing outward. Neither gun had a prepared firing position that covered the interior of the defensive perimeter. It was a textbook defensive layout for a textbook attack. When Weber's Sherman entered the farmyard, it was inside the defensive geometry. The 2nd 88 could not traverse far enough to engage without risk of hitting its own infantry. German infantry can solve that problem. 60 combat-experienced soldiers can overwhelm 3 tanks in close terrain with the right equipment and the right coordination. Kroll's company had Panzerfausts. They had the numbers. What they did not have was 10 seconds. Weber's 2nd and 3rd Shermans came through the hedgerow gap at intervals of approximately 8 seconds each. 3 tanks in the farmyard in under 30 seconds. All 3 immediately engaging. The 2nd 88's crew abandoned the gun when the 3rd Sherman entered their line of sight. The German infantry, well-trained, experienced, and now in a situation their doctrine had never anticipated, did exactly what soldiers do when the expected defensive geometry collapses. They paused. It was a half-second pause. The pause of men whose mental model of the battle has just been invalidated, you who are looking for an order that makes sense in the new reality. That half-second was the battle. Sergeant Cole's crew, Cole himself, hands wrapped, operating on adrenaline and anger, had kept up small arms fire from the drainage ditch throughout the maneuver, fixing the German infantry's attention forward. When the tanks entered the farmyard and the 2nd 88 was abandoned, Cole's crew stood up in the ditch and began advancing. The German infantry company, caught between tank fire from behind and infantry fire from the front, began to break by sections. It was not a rout. These were Das Reich soldiers, not conscripts. But it was a withdrawal. A retreat that Kroll had not authorized and could not stop from his command post because his field telephone line had been cut by the initial firefight. At 07:03, and at a cost of 1 tank destroyed, 1 tank disabled, 4 men killed, Cole's driver, Private William T. Patterson, 22, from Decatur, Illinois, Private Morris Feldstein, 23, Brooklyn, and 2 infantrymen from the half-tracks whose names were not recorded in time. 3 men critically wounded, and ammunition stocks across all 3 remaining tanks below 20%. Carrefour Brûlé was taken. Weber found the crossroads. He found the 2 abandoned 88s, both intact enough to confirm identification. He found 37 dead from the German company. He found 11 prisoners, including a wounded unteroffizier who looked at the tanks coming through the farmyard and said, in serviceable English, on the thing that Weber's executive officer Okafor wrote down in his diary that same day. You came from the wrong direction. At Kroll's command post, the field telephone had been dead for 22 minutes. When the runner arrived with the withdrawal report from the crossroads position, Kroll read it twice. Then he sat down. Then he wrote a single line in his situation report before forwarding it up to division. Position lost. Cause: American armor utilized approach corridor evaluated as impassable by engineering assessment. Assessment was technically correct. Assessment did not account for command-level improvisation under fire. He crossed out that last sentence. Then he wrote it again and left it. Part 5. The verdict: Carrefour Brûlé on the morning of July 28, 1944, after the firing stopped. He looked like every other small piece of Norman farmland that the war had used and discarded. 2 silenced 88s. Shell craters in the lane. A Sherman with its hull cracked open, cooling metal ticking in the morning quiet. The hedgerow Weber had broken through would not grow back for years. Farmers noticed it for a decade afterward, a gap in the landscape, an absence where something old had been destroyed to let something American through. Weber walked the position for 20 minutes before the next unit reached him. Lieutenant Okafor found him standing beside the second 88, looking at the gun's traverse mechanism, the physical evidence of how far it could and couldn't turn. Okafor wrote, he wasn't triumphant, and he looked like a man who had just passed a very difficult exam and wasn't sure yet what grade he'd received. The advance continued. Avranches fell on July 30th. Patton's Third Army poured through the gap. The numbers tell the story. In the 6 days following the Avranches breakout, Third Army advanced approximately 220 kilometers, liberated over 30 towns, and shattered 3 German divisions beyond reconstitution. The war in the West accelerated in ways that Wehrmacht planning had not projected as possible. Das Reich Division's after-action report, compiled in early August and later captured by Allied intelligence, contained a section on American tactical patterns that was notable for its tone. German after-action reports are not known for admitting error. This one was an exception. Attributed to the divisional operations officer, an Oberstleutnant Friedrich Brauer, it read, the fundamental error in our defensive architecture at Coutances was the assumption that American tactical behavior would remain consistent with their documented doctrine. This assumption was incorrect. American junior officers, particularly at company level, demonstrated an ability to improvise under fire that our defensive geometry did not account for. The Third Army's consistent pressure against the principle of least resistance, its refusal to accept the ground as given, constitutes a tactical philosophy that we failed to adequately respect. It is not the American soldier's equipment or his numbers that create the problem. It is his willingness to look at the ground from the enemy's perspective. We taught our engineers to build defenses against attacks, and we did not adequately prepare them for an enemy who does not attack, who instead redirects. Patton, receiving the report of C Company's action through the chain of command, said nothing publicly. He was already looking east, but in his personal diary written the same evening he noted, young Weber found the door. That is the only skill that matters when every road is blocked. The lesson, if a lesson needs to be stated, which perhaps it doesn't because the story has already stated it, is not about courage. Courage was not the variable. Courage was present on both sides of that farmyard in equal and terrible measure. The variable was this: when the plan collapsed, when the intelligence was wrong, when the terrain betrayed the approach and the orders from headquarters made no tactical sense, James Weber stopped trying to solve the problem the enemy expected him to solve. He asked instead what the enemy was afraid of, what they had prepared against, what they had decided was impossible. And then he did the impossible thing. That is the Patton Principle, applied in a 4-meter lane by a 29-year-old from Macon, Georgia, who had not slept properly in 3 days. It is not a strategy you can diagram on a map. It is a way of looking at the world, at obstacles as information, at the enemy's confidence as a vulnerability, at the map itself as a description of someone else's assumptions about reality. The Germans built excellent defenses. Their engineering was precise. Their mathematics were correct. Weber's approach was impassable according to the assessment. Weber simply declined to be bound by the assessment, and the abandoned farmhouse at Hameau de Vaucelles still stands. The Norman farm family returned after the liberation. The outbuilding where Mwangi and Tran sheltered the elderly woman and 2 children, their names were never recorded in any American document, was repaired in 1946. The hedgerow gap that Weber's tank made was filled in by the mid-1950s. You can stand there today. Coutances is an hour's drive from the Normandy beaches. The crossroads is unmarked. There is no plaque for C Company 8th Tank Battalion. The road is just a road, but the ground is still firmer than the 1938 maps show. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the European theater, the Third Army, or anywhere in the Normandy campaign, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What campaign? What town did they help take? And those stories live in family memory and nowhere else. Put them here. They belong here.